Uh, Let me just quickly tell you a little bit about myself. I've been in Kazakhstan 25 years. I'm a partner at Kinstellar, which is an international law firm focused on the emerging markets of sort of Central Europe to Central Asia. I run our office in Kazakhstan as well as our new office in Uzbekistan. I'm going to talk to you today about the change in the legal regime with respect to mining. Our first speaker from the Ministry of Investment and Development already covered some of what I'm going to cover, which is the changes to the subsurface law. This may be a little bit redundant. I'll try to skip over those parts. The code on subsurface and subsurface use was passed at the end of last year and came into force in the middle of 2018. It replaced the law on subsurface, basically with the same name, subsurface and subsurface use, which previously regulated the regime for all subsurface use under a regime that was more or less the same for all types of subsurface use. What's notable here is that the subsurface code, which is, by being a code, first of all, it has more force, meaning to the extent there are conflicts between it and other laws of Kazakhstan, it will take precedence, but which is an important issue if there are questions about what is contained in the code. But what's critical is that it was looked at and developed on the basis of Canadian and Australian practice in the mining sector. As I said, under the previous regime, the subsurface use, whether it was for oil and gas, uranium, mining, was treated more or less the same until 1999. August of 1999, there was a regime by which subsurface rights were granted pursuant to a license. And then you had to conclude a contract. After that, they simply dropped the requirement for a license, though existing licenses remained in force, and simply said you needed to conclude a subsurface use contract. In the early days, those contracts were negotiated fairly heavily. Over time, they became based more on a model, and there was little room to negotiate, although you did negotiate many of the obligations you had for the extent of your investment obligations and so on, and your social obligations critically as well. The new subsurface code treats the various regimes differently. For oil and gas, the regime remains more or less the same. You still need to have a subsurface use contract, which is basically either an exploration and production contract or a production contract. Or you need to, for uranium, it also remains subject to a contract, though there's no real point in discussing uranium development here because that's reserved for the national company. So none of you are going to really be able to get into a uranium project unless you want to partner up with Kazatomprom. But notably, the regime was changed with respect to mining, and that was really the intention, and if somebody says otherwise, I think it'd be surprising. I think they understood that 25 years ago, everybody came to Kazakhstan, and the good projects soon got picked off. And what you left with were projects that were perhaps, depending on the markets, sometimes profitable, sometimes marginal, and they needed to find a way to spur development of the investment in the mining sector. So there was a simplified regime applied to mining. For minerals now, the regime, as you already heard, is based on simply a license. No longer do you need to have a subsurface use contract, which is simpler. In the existing contracts, if there are existing mining projects out there, those remain in force, and those obligations remain, though they can switch to a license regime if they like. It's not clear whether that will yield benefits, but that's something that can be considered. With the new regime, the exploration license can be granted or a production license. The exploration license is typically granted for a period of 6 years. There is a right to extend for another 5 years if necessary, and if you have a block that consists, a license covering a block, 10 blocks or more, there's an obligation to relinquish 40% of that if you want an extension, which sort of makes sense. It says you've looked at it, you've come up dry in a number of places, you should be giving back some of it. The production license will typically be granted for 25 years, and there's a right to extend for similar period or periods depending on whether there's production left to be had. Getting the rights should be simpler, as we heard from the representative from the ministry. There is supposed to be a first come, first serve system where basically you file an application, and if you sort of should be, if you're the first one up, you should get it if everything else looks right, and then you have to go through a process where you ultimately provide them with sort of a mining plan and an abandonment plan, but it should be simpler to get. The big question is whether in practice this is the case. I know they'll tell you it is. I'm not denying that it is. I'm just saying that I think in practice, like everything else, we'll always find that things don't quite work as smoothly as the law would like, and so there's opportunities to improve that as we get more experience. And you should talk to the ministry about that. I'm sure they'll be very helpful and be willing to discuss those issues. If you do get an exploration license, be assured that under the law you have the exclusive right to obtain production rights. As I said, there's no need when you have a license to agree on a work program. Basically, your obligations are set out in the code in terms of your minimum investment obligations. So, and that's based on the stage, whether it's exploration or production. It's based on the number of blocks you have and the types of minerals. So you should be able to go to the code and figure out what your obligations are going to be. What's an interesting concept is the idea of retention, which they introduced into the code, and this allows you to basically put on hold your production license for a period of 5 years with the possibility to extend it for another 5 years in certain situations, the primary one being that it's just at that time non-economic to make those investments. What it does is it puts the license holder in a position where it reduces its investment obligations into the project, though there are certain payments that will still need to be made. Those obligations are things, expenses for training, for funding research and development, and so on. But it can be useful if the timing is wrong to continue to produce when prices are particularly low, or if there are technological reasons that at the time you can't make the investment. So it is, I think that's a very positive step. The liquidation obligations have been changed. In the past, you had to develop a liquidation fund from a percentage of your expenditures. I think it was 1%, and had to be put up in an account. And the problem with that, quite honestly, was you had to put up money which you couldn't really do much with, but at the same time, it wasn't always enough to fund the liquidation obligations when a project ended. Now they've changed it. They've said that you can pledge money in a bank account. You can provide a parent or a bank guarantee, and that could even come from a foreign bank if you wish. Or you can obtain a certain insurance to cover these obligations. So that's recognition that there are probably other better ways to fund liquidation than simply just putting money in a bank account. The transfer of subsurface use rights is always an issue. People get these rights. In the past, there were requirements to get the competent authority consent, which in this case is the Ministry of Investments and Development for mining. If it's oil and gas, it would be the Ministry of Energy. As well as the state had in the past had a priority right of purchase, which meant you had to get the state's waiver of its basically its preemptive right to purchase if you were selling it to someone else. This has been modified a bit. Basically, the competent authority consent is still required for most transfers, but the priority right of the state has been cut back, and it doesn't apply to hard minerals. It really only applies to strategic deposits, which is in this case uranium, And in the oil and gas sector, it's only those fields designated as strategic reserves. But for mining, it doesn't pose an issue. So you need competent authority approval, which generally tends to be fairly easy to get. What's more important, I think, is they switch the obligation to obtain this from the seller to the acquirer, which makes sense, because the ministry was really looking at who's going to be the new person in the project. It's not so interested in you selling it that you should get it, and it puts that obligation and makes it simpler because it's the acquirer who has to obtain it. Exploration licenses cannot be transferred during the first year, but that shouldn't be a big surprise. I mean, the idea is not to grant it to you and then have you flip it to somebody at a profit, which was historically a problem. Consent, once granted, is now valid for a year. Previously, it was valid for 6 months. And if you're doing sort of M&A type transactions in the mining sector, this is a good thing because sometimes transactions took a long time to close, particularly if you needed the competition consent, which could take a long time. And if you didn't get it within 6 months, you either needed to extend that consent or you needed to, in theory, if you didn't get it, then you'd have to obtain a second consent. So this gives more time to actually close the transaction. There was also an obligation under the old law to notify the competent authority within 5 days once you actually finished the transfer. Meant the acquirer had an obligation to notify that it had acquired an interest. 5 days was sort of a bit short. They've extended that now to a month, so that's significantly more practical, let's just say. And also, they've taken away the obligation to obtain consent if the transfer is related to subsurface rights connected to, from the government or a state company, so, which makes sense, because obviously if they're either the acquirer or the seller, this shouldn't be a problem. And also, finally, I'll just note that consent is no longer required to pledge your subsurface rights, which is actually a very good thing, because that's often used when you're obtaining financing for development of the project. So, anyway, that's it. Thank you, and if you have questions later, I'll take it.